The small jazz club, tucked between two crumbling buildings on a forgotten street corner, smelled of stale smoke and spilled whiskey, the faded neon sign casting a soft red glow over the cracked sidewalk. It wasn't much, just a place where the lost, the broken, the hungry for music gathered. But for Clara, it was her refuge. As a singer, she had always felt most alive under the haze of dim lighting and the sound of the saxophone filling the air, the rhythm of the drums beating against her chest. The world outside didn't see her, or if it did, it only saw the oversized body she carried with a kind of quiet shame. At the diner where she worked, people never made eye contact. She was just the heavy-set waitress with the tired eyes, who always brought the coffee and grinned through the hurt. It was a world that saw her fat and nothing else. At least in the club, when she sang, when her voice soared through the smoky air, they had to listen. But even there, she wasn't immune to the whispers, the sidelong glances from some of the more refined patrons who expected grace and beauty in their entertainers. She was used to it, had always been used to it. As a child, her mother had taught her how to smile through the hurt, how to bow her head and let the world talk behind her back, how to make herself small when the world kept making her large. Clara had spent most of her life fitting herself into spaces that didn't fit her. And yet, when the music filled her lungs, when she sang the notes that wrapped around her like an old friend, for a brief moment, she could forget that she was too much, too loud, too big, too dark. That night, as she stepped onto the small stage in the corner of the room, her body felt heavier than usual. The spotlight was too bright, the air too hot, and the familiar faces staring at her were too critical. She pulled the microphone closer, her fingers trembling as she gripped it, trying to steady herself. The band started up, a slow, haunting melody, and Clara closed her eyes, letting the music take her over. But today, something was different. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her like 1,000 eyes watching, judging, and her voice faltered, a crack in the otherwise perfect harmony. She cleared her throat and sang louder, pushing her voice to fill the gaps, to prove she was enough. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence wasn't wanted here. It wasn't just the men in suits, the women with their too tight smiles and too perfect dresses. It was the ache in her chest, the constant reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how beautifully she sang, it would never be enough to make her beautiful. That night, when the final note rang out and the applause was polite but hollow, Clara stepped off the stage with her head low, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a napkin. She made her way to the back alley behind the club, desperate for fresh air, desperate for a moment of peace. But there, leaning against the brick wall, was someone she hadn't expected. A woman. Tall, slender, with striking blonde hair and a kind smile that reached her eyes. "That was beautiful," the woman said softly, pushing herself off the wall and walking toward Clara. "You sing with all your heart." Clara hesitated, not used to being spoken to like that. People didn't stop to compliment her, not in the diner, not in the streets. But this woman's gaze held no judgment, only admiration. "Thank you," Clara muttered, taking a step back, not sure if she was ready for the interaction. The woman didn't flinch. "I'm Natalie," she said. "I've been coming here for a while, and I have to say, I've never heard a voice like yours. You've got something special." Clara's face reddened, and she lowered her gaze. "You don't mean that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Natalie shook her head, her eyes steady. "I do," she said firmly. "And you should believe it." Clara's heart beat faster, but not from the usual fear or self-doubt. Something about Natalie made her feel seen, in a way no one had ever seen her before. Not just the heavy-set woman serving coffee, but the person she was inside, the one who loved music with an aching passion. Natalie continued, her voice soft and warm. "You know, I used to be like you," she said, her words catching Clara off guard. "I used to hide. I used to think I had to make myself smaller to fit into the world. But I don't do that anymore." Clara looked at her, intrigued despite herself. "You?" she asked, feeling a pang of disbelief. You're perfect," she added, not knowing how else to put it. Natalie's laugh was soft, but there was something fierce in it. "No, I'm not. But I'm me. And that's enough." Clara swallowed, unsure of how to respond. For the first time in her life, she felt someone who wasn't her mother or a sympathetic soul, look at her and see something beyond the body, beyond the size, beyond the years of shame she carried with her. Natalie stepped closer, her hand resting gently on Clara's arm, a gesture of warmth and comfort. "There's an audition coming up," Natalie said, her voice calm but determined. "A spot in a new club downtown. I think you should try out. You could make it, Clara. You could be more than just a waitress or a backup singer. You deserve a stage where they'll see you." Clara froze, her mind spinning. An audition? For someone like her? The thought was ridiculous. No one had ever seen her as anything other than the heavy woman who tried too hard, sang too loud. But Natalie's eyes held a fire that Clara couldn't ignore. There was something about the way she looked at her, the way she believed in her, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to prove everyone wrong. Maybe it wasn't too late for her to step into the light and own the space she had always been told didn't belong to her. "I can't," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I'm not what they want." Natalie smiled again, that same fierce, knowing smile. "What if you are?" And for the first time in her life, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she might be. That night, after she finished her shift and walked home through the quiet streets, the cool breeze carrying the scent of rain, Clara found herself standing in front of the mirror, looking at the reflection she had spent so many years avoiding. She was big. She was heavy. She was different. But maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. Maybe she wasn't going to shrink into the background anymore, not for anyone. The next day, Clara stood at the door of the club, the invitation clutched in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. This was her chance to prove she could be more than they ever expected. She didn't know what the future would hold, but as she stepped inside and heard the music in the background, she couldn't help but believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she was finally worthy of being seen. The air inside the club was thick with anticipation, the hum of conversation mixing with the distant sound of a piano being tuned. Clara clenched the small audition slip in her hand, her palms damp with sweat as she scanned the dimly lit room. The space was bigger than the jazz club where she usually performed, sleek, polished, filled with men in sharp suits and women in elegant gowns, who sipped from crystal glasses and eyed the stage with critical curiosity. This was not the kind of place that welcomed women like her. But she was here. She was here because for the first time, someone had looked at her and seen more than her weight, more than the color of her skin. She was here because Natalie had believed in her when no one else had, and now she had to believe in herself. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, making her way to the back of the room, where a group of nervous performers waited their turn. Some of them glanced at her, their eyes flicking up and down her frame before quickly looking away, as if unsure of how to process her presence. Clara felt the familiar sting of judgment, the whisper of shame creeping up her spine, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had spent too many years trying to shrink into the background. Not today. A sharply dressed man with slick back hair and a clipboard called the next name, and a tall, willowy woman in a sequin dress sauntered onto the stage, her voice smooth as silk as she crooned into the microphone. The crowd murmured in approval, nodding along to the melody, and Clara felt her stomach tighten. These were professionals. These were women with the kind of beauty that made people stop and stare, the kind of presence that made a stage their own. And then there was her. A woman too large, too dark, too different for a world that thrived on perfection. But then she heard Natalie's voice in her head. What if you were what they want? Clara swallowed hard, gripping the fabric of her dress, a simple navy blue number that hugged her curves in ways she had always hated. When she had tried it on that morning, she had nearly convinced herself not to come, staring at the mirror, seeing nothing but flaws. But now, standing here, about to step onto that stage, she realized something. Her body had carried her through everything. Through the nights spent wiping tables at the diner, through the long walks home with aching feet, through the lonely evenings when she had wondered if she would ever be enough. It had carried her through loss, through rejection, through a world that tried to make her believe she wasn't worthy of being seen. But she was here, and she would be seen. The sequin singer finished her set, bowing gracefully as polite applause rippled through the room. The man with the clipboard called the next name. Clara's name. For a moment, she thought her legs might give out beneath her, but somehow, she forced herself forward, stepping up onto the stage, feeling the heat of the spotlight pressing against her skin. The murmurs in the crowd were immediate. She heard them, low voices questioning, skeptical, already dismissing her before she had even opened her mouth. She saw the way the pianist hesitated, his fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys, as if unsure if she was even worth playing for. Clara took a breath. And then she sang. The first note was low, deep, rich like honey and whiskey, vibrating through the air with a power that silenced the whispers in an instant. She closed her eyes and let it pour out of her, let every rejection, every cruel comment, every moment of doubt fuel the melody, filling every inch of that room with something raw, something undeniable. The pianist recovered quickly, his fingers finding the chords, the band following suit, wrapping her voice in a symphony of sound. The crowd, stunned into silence, watched her, truly watched her, their skepticism fading, replaced by something else. Something Clara had never seen before when people looked at her. They were in awe. She owned that stage, filled it with everything she had been told she was too much of, too loud, too emotional, too big. She let it all out, let herself be, and when the final note hung in the air like a breath waiting to be exhaled, there was nothing but silence. And then the applause came. A wave of it. Not polite. Not hesitant. Real. Thunderous. Overwhelming. Clara felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away for too long. She had spent her life waiting to be enough. But tonight, she wasn't just enough. She was everything. As she stepped off the stage, still trembling from the rush of it, she felt a hand grasp her arm. Natalie. Beaming. Eyes shining with pride. "I told you," she whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "I told you were meant for this." But before Clara could respond, before she could even begin to process what had just happened, a voice cut through the crowd. "Well, well," a man drawled, stepping forward, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable. "That was unexpected." He was older, with sharp blue eyes and a cigarette dangling from his fingers. The kind of man who owned places like this. The kind of man who decided who got to be on stage and who didn't. Clara's heart pounded. "Unexpected good or unexpected bad?" she asked, surprised by the strength in her own voice. The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That depends," he said slowly, exhaling smoke. "You ever thought about singing somewhere bigger than this?" Clara froze. Natalie's grip on her arm tightened. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Bigger. Bigger. She had never dared to dream that far. Had never let herself believe that someone like her could belong in places where only the flawless were allowed to shine. But here she was. Being seen. Being wanted. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't afraid of taking up space. She was ready to take the world by storm. Clara stood there, feeling the weight of the man's words hanging in the air like smoke, curling around her chest, pressing down with an intensity she wasn't sure how to handle. "Bigger," he said again, as if the word itself could be a key to unlocking some hidden door she had never dared to approach. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't tell if it was the thrill or the fear that kept her quiet. The man looked at her expectantly, his eyes scanning her face, taking in the wide, full contours of her, the roundness of her cheeks, the fullness of her figure. His gaze was calculating, not like the others who had stared at her with disdain. He seemed to see something in her. "You could be more than a backup singer," he said, his voice low but firm. "You could fill bigger spaces than this." His words struck her like a jolt of lightning, a rush of excitement mixed with disbelief. She glanced at Natalie, who was still holding her arm, her grip tight, as if afraid Clara might break under the weight of this unexpected opportunity. "What do you think?" Natalie asked, her voice soft but with an edge of excitement. Clara wanted to ask if she was ready, if she was worthy of something so big, something so outside the small world she had spent her whole life in. But when she looked back at the man, something inside her surged. The years of hiding, of shrinking away from attention, the years of walking into rooms where people looked through her or looked at her with judgment, they had made her tired, made her weak. But tonight, standing on that stage, hearing the applause, something had shifted. She felt a fire inside her, an ember she hadn't known existed. She wasn't sure if she was ready for all this change, but in that moment, she knew she couldn't turn away from it. Not again. Not anymore. She looked up at the man. "What do you mean by bigger?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. He smiled, a half smile, the kind that hinted at secrets. "Bigger places. Clubs with bigger audiences. Bigger paychecks," he said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "People would pay to hear you sing, Clara. Real money. Bigger crowds, bigger stages. You're ready for that. You just need someone to give you the shot." Clara's heart skipped in her chest. The words sounded too good to be true, but there was no denying the hunger in his eyes. He was offering her the kind of life she had spent years dreaming about, but never thought possible. Could she leave everything behind? Could she leave the small, safe space she had built for herself, where she was familiar, known, even if it meant enduring the harsh judgments of those who couldn't see past her body? Would it be worth it to take that leap into something unknown, into a world that demanded more of her than she had ever been asked to give? "I don't know," Clara whispered, the reality of what he was offering washing over her in waves. "I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't enough." The man didn't flinch. "The world will tell you that," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The world will always tell you that. But you're still here. And that's what matters." Clara took a step back, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, flashing through memories of her childhood, of being told she was too much, too loud, too different. She had spent years trying to shrink herself, trying to make her body smaller so the world would see her as worthy of love, of attention. But in this moment, in this place, she was more than enough. More than the waitress. More than the singer hiding behind a microphone. More than the heavy-set woman who was told she would never amount to anything. She was Clara. She was someone who could make people feel, someone whose voice had the power to fill a room with emotion. She had been told to stay in the shadows for so long, but she wasn't going to let herself be a background player anymore. She was going to take the spotlight. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what that would mean. She looked at Natalie, who stood by her side, her face full of encouragement. It was as though Natalie had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Clara to finally see her own worth. "What do you think?" Clara asked, her voice uncertain but hopeful. Natalie smiled, a quiet warmth in her eyes. "I think you deserve it. All of it." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath, and turned back to the man. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The man smiled, nodding with satisfaction. "You've got guts, Clara. I'll set it up. You'll have your chance." And just like that, it was decided. The next few weeks were a blur of rehearsals, phone calls, and paperwork. Clara found herself thrust into a world she had never imagined for herself. A world of professional singers, agents, and high-end clubs. She was no longer just a waitress at a rundown diner or a backup singer in a smoky club. She was someone, and the world was starting to take notice. But with every step she took toward this new life, She couldn't help but feel the fear creeping in. Was she really cut out for this? Could she survive in a world where people only saw what they wanted to see? She was no longer invisible, but was she ready to let herself be seen? The night of her first big performance at the club was the hardest one yet. She stood backstage, her fingers shaking as she adjusted the microphone, trying to steady her breath. The roar of the crowd echoed in her ears, but it was nothing compared to the roar of her own insecurities. What if they didn't like her? What if she failed? She could already feel the weight of the judgment from the people she couldn't see, those who would look at her and see only the body she had spent years trying to change. But then she heard the familiar sound of the band starting up, the quiet murmur of anticipation from the audience. The familiar rhythm filled her ears, and she realized something. This wasn't just about her body. This was about the music. This was about her voice, her soul, and the fact that for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to hide anymore. She stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding her for a moment before her eyes adjusted. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath, and then she sang. The music enveloped her like a warm blanket, and for the first time in her life, Clara didn't care about what the world thought of her. She was here. She was enough. The crowd didn't see her size. They didn't see the things she had always feared. They only heard her voice, raw and unrestrained, filling the room with something real. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. And in that moment, she knew there was no going back. Clara's voice soared through the smoky club, weaving its way through the hush of the crowd like silk catching on the wind. Each note she sang was a confession, a battle cry, a love letter to the part of herself she had hidden away for so long. She sang of pain, of longing, of nights spent staring at her own reflection wondering if she would ever be more than what the world saw. She sang for the girl who had been mocked, for the woman who had been overlooked, for the dreamer who had once believed the stars were too far away. And as her voice filled the space, something changed. The people in the crowd, their faces illuminated by the dim golden glow of the hanging lights, were no longer watching her with quiet curiosity or hesitant approval. They were captivated. She could feel it in the air, thick and electric, the way their eyes widened, the way their shoulders softened, the way their heads tilted just slightly forward as if afraid to miss a single note. She could see them forgetting, if only for a moment, that she was the kind of woman they weren't supposed to admire, that she didn't fit the mold of what a star should look like. In this moment, in this song, she was undeniable. When the final notes slipped from her lips and melted into the air, a long, trembling silence followed. It stretched out, fragile as glass, before the first clap broke through it. Then another. Then a thunderous roar of applause. Clara stood there, breathless, her chest rising and falling, her hands trembling at her sides. She had done it. She had truly done it. The man who had given her this chance, Mr. Langston, stood at the bar, nodding slowly, his usual smirk replaced by something more sincere. Natalie was crying, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled napkin, her smile wide and proud. But Clara barely saw them. She was too overwhelmed, too full of something she couldn't yet name. She left the stage on unsteady legs, slipping through the velvet curtain into the backstage hallway, pressing a hand to her chest as if to steady the wild beating of her heart. The sound of the crowd was still echoing in her ears when a voice cut through it. "That was something else," a deep voice said. She turned, startled, to find a man leaning against the wall, his hat tilted low over his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You sing like you've been hurt," he said. Clara stiffened. "Everybody's been hurt," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He chuckled, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. "Maybe," he said, "but not everybody can make people feel it the way you do." Clara wasn't sure what to say to that, so she didn't say anything at all. He stuck out his hand. "Name's Samuel," he said. "I know you're Clara." She hesitated only a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was warm, firm. There was something about him that unsettled her, but not in a bad way. In a way that made her heart pick up speed. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked, tucking his hands into his pockets. "I just got here," she said. "That ain't what I mean." His eyes held something she couldn't quite decipher. "I mean, you ever think about getting out of all this? Really making something big out of that voice of yours?" Clara's throat tightened. Of course, she had thought about it. She had dreamed of it in the quiet of her small apartment, had imagined herself on grand stages, in places where people wouldn't look at her and see only what they expected to see. But dreams were dangerous things. "I don't know," she admitted. "You should," Samuel said. "You got more talent than half the people who've already made it. But talent ain't enough. You gotta have guts. You gotta be willing to take a risk." Clara swallowed. She had already taken a risk just stepping onto that stage tonight. But could she take another? Could she leave behind everything she had ever known, step into a world that might never fully accept her, might chew her up and spit her out the moment she stumbled? "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, as if he expected that answer, and took a step back. "You do that. But don't take too long. The world don't wait." And with that, he disappeared into the club, leaving Clara alone with thoughts too big for the small room she stood in. Over the next few weeks, she kept seeing Samuel. He came to every performance, always watching from the shadows, always waiting for her after the show with some new challenge, some new push. "There's a record label looking for new talent," he'd say. Or, "I know a guy who books real big shows up in Chicago." Or, "You got it, Clara. You just gotta stop being scared." But fear was a hard thing to shake. And as much as she wanted to believe she could be something more, the ghosts of her past whispered otherwise. It wasn't until the night she overheard two club owners talking about her, about how a woman like that could never be a real star, about how she was just a novelty act, that something inside her snapped. That was the night she walked up to Samuel and said, "All right, I'll do it." And just like that, everything changed. The next few months were a whirlwind. Samuel introduced her to people she never would have met on her own. He got her into rooms where decisions were made, where records were cut, where stars were born. But the higher she climbed, the harder the falls became. The industry wasn't kind to women like her. She was too big, too black, too much. They wanted her voice, but not her body. They wanted her sound, but not her presence. They wanted her to be something she wasn't. And she had to decide, would she change for them? Or would she fight to be seen on her own terms? And then, just when she thought she had made peace with who she was, just when she was ready to take the next step, Samuel dropped a bombshell. "I've been lying to you," he said one night, his voice thick with regret. "About what?" Clara asked, dread curling in her stomach. He looked at her, eyes dark with something like shame. "About who I am. About why I'm here." And in that moment, Clara realized that the biggest betrayal wasn't from the industry, wasn't from the people who had tried to keep her down. It was from the one person she had begun to trust. The one person who had made her believe she could be more. And as she stared at him, heart pounding, she knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. Samuel took a deep breath, his fingers twitching at his sides, as if he were holding back the weight of something too heavy to carry alone. Clara felt her stomach tighten, a slow dread unfurling in the pit of her soul, the kind that comes when you know your world is about to split in half, but you can't do anything to stop it. "I ain't who I told you I was," he finally said, his voice lower now, rougher, like gravel scraping against the silence. Clara crossed her arms, her body bracing itself before her mind could even catch up. "Then who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but thin, like stretched glass. Samuel hesitated, glancing away before locking eyes with her again. "I was sent here," he admitted, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them. "Not just to find talent. Not just to help you. I was watching you, Clara. And not for the reasons you think. Her breath caught, a sharp thing that lodged in her throat. Watching me, she repeated, the words slow, careful, as if speaking them too quickly would make them more real. Why? He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Because there are people out there who don't want you to rise. People who see what you're doing. A big, dark-skinned woman refusing to be quiet, refusing to shrink, and they don't like it. They don't like what it means. They don't like what it'll inspire. So they sent me to keep you close. To make sure you never got too high up. To make sure you stayed right where they wanted you. Clara felt the air leave her lungs, a slow, unraveling thing that left her dizzy. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. You were spying on me? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. Samuel flinched. At first, he admitted. But then I saw you. Really saw you. And I couldn't do it no more. I started to believe in you, Clara. I started to believe in what you could be. What you already are. But she wasn't listening. She was drowning. Every moment they had sped together, every word he had said, every encouragement, every push, it had all been a lie. A trick. A carefully laid trap to keep her caged in a world that had never wanted her to escape. The anger came next, hot and blinding, a wildfire in her veins. You stood there, night after night, telling me I was more. Telling me I could do this. And the whole time, you were making sure I couldn't, she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. Samuel stepped forward, reaching for her, but she jerked away, her body rigid with betrayal. I stopped, he said. I stopped doing what they wanted. I went against M, Clara. I was supposed to keep you small, but I couldn't. I didn't. And you expect me to believe that? She snapped, her vision blurring at the edges. After everything? Samuel's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I don't expect nothing, he said quietly. I just needed you to know the truth. Before... He stopped himself, shaking his head. Before what? Before they found out he had turned on them? Before they came after him? Before they came after her? Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a wild, panicked rhythm. Who are they, Samuel? She demanded. Who sent you? He hesitated, his face torn between fear and resolve. And that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. You're still protecting them, she said, her voice hollow. Even now. It ain't that simple, he said, his voice strained. It never is. She took a step back, something inside her hardening, closing off. I trusted you, she whispered. And you made a fool out of me. Samuel's face twisted, pain flashing in his eyes. No, he said fiercely. I was the fool. For not telling you sooner. For letting them get in my head. But I ain't working for them no more, Clara. And they know it. He took a shaky breath. Which means I ain't got much time left. A cold hand gripped her spine. What do you mean? She asked, her voice quieter now, edged with something dangerously close to fear. Samuel looked around, his eyes scanning the darkened club as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. I mean, they don't let people walk away, he said. And they sure as hell don't let people talk. Clara's breath hitched. You're in danger. We both are, he said. And if you don't leave now, if you don't take this shot while you still can, you might not get another one. She shook her head, everything inside her warring against the idea of running. No, she said. I worked too hard for this. I ain't leaving just 'cause some people don't like it. Samuel's face darkened. This ain't about what they like, Clara. It's about what they'll do. And they'll do whatever it takes to stop you. The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say that she had fought her whole life to be seen, to be heard, and she wouldn't disappear now. But deep down she knew. She had always known. The world had never been safe for women like her. And now, it was downright deadly. Come with me, Samuel said suddenly. The word stunned her. What? Come with me, he repeated. We'll get out of here. Start over. Somewhere they can't find us. The idea was impossible. Reckless. Terrifying. But the way he looked at her, the way his voice trembled just slightly, it made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a lie this time. Maybe he meant it. Maybe this time, he was telling the truth. But before she could answer, before she could decide, the door to the club slammed open. Heavy footsteps. Voices too sharp, too purposeful. And then, a gunshot. A scream. The world shattered around her. And everything went dark. Clara hit the floor before she even realized what was happening, her ears ringing from the gunshot, her breath trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat. The club erupted into chaos, tables overturned, glass shattered, bodies rushed for the exits in a frantic, stampeding blur of movement. The dim glow of the club lights flickered above her like dying stars as she scrambled backward, her heart hammering, her mind trying to catch up to the violence that had just shattered the world she knew. Samuel was still standing, but barely. His broad frame staggered, one hand gripping his side, dark blood seeping between his fingers, staining the crisp white of his shirt. "Run!" he choked out, his voice strained, raw. But Clara couldn't move. Not yet. Not while he was still standing. Not while she could still reach him. "No!" she whispered, shaking her head, crawling toward him as the men in dark suits pushed through the terrified crowd, their guns drawn, their faces set with the cold, merciless precision of men who had done this before, men who had killed before. "We gotta go," Samuel gasped, reaching for her, his grip slick with his own blood as he pulled her up to her feet. Clara's body felt disconnected, like she was floating in a dream she couldn't wake from, but Samuel was moving, dragging her, forcing her to stumble forward as bullets ripped through the walls behind them, splintering wood and sending dust and debris raining down like a cruel kind of confetti. They burst out into the alley behind the club, the night air thick with smoke, with the scent of burned rubber and spilled whiskey and the faint, distant wail of a siren that was too far away to save them. Samuel's breathing was ragged, his grip tightening on her wrist as they ran, his steps slowing with every second, his strength bleeding out onto the cracked pavement beneath them. "Just a little further," he murmured, more to himself than to her, as if sheer willpower could keep his body upright, could stop the inevitable. But Clara wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. She could hear the uneven rhythm of his breath, could feel the way his weight was shifting, leaning on her, as if his body was already betraying him. "Samuel, we have to stop." "No!" He cut her off, his voice sharp, desperate. "If we stop, they win." But his body had already made the choice for him. His legs buckled, and before Clara could catch him, he was down, collapsing against the damp brick wall of the alley, his hand slipping from hers as he slid to the ground. "No, no, no!" she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound at his side, as if she could force the blood back into his body, as if she could stop what was happening just by wanting it badly enough. Samuel coughed, a weak, broken sound that sent a fresh wave of fear surging through her. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now, barely a breath. "You gotta keep going, Dot." She shook her head violently, her vision blurring with tears. "Not without you." His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so sad. "You always were stubborn," he murmured. His hand, slick with blood, reached up, cupping the side of her face with a tenderness that shattered her completely. "Listen to me," he said, his fingers trembling. "You were meant for more than this. You were meant to be heard." Clara gritted her teeth, shaking her head as tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the grime of the alley, with the blood on her hands. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. Samuel exhaled a shaky laugh. "You never were alone," he said. "Not really." His gaze softened, his body sinking further against the wall, the light in his eyes flickering. "Sing for me, Clara." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from her lungs. No, she pleaded. No, don't you do this. But Samuel's eyes were already closing. His body was already going still. And Clara was breaking. A sob ripped from her throat, raw and aching, as she pressed her forehead against his, her fingers still clutching his shirt, as if holding on to him could keep him here, could stop the inevitable. But it couldn't. And she knew that. Somewhere deep inside, she had always known. But she wasn't ready. She would never be ready. The sound of footsteps echoed down the alley, and Clara knew she didn't have time to grieve. Not yet. Not here. Not like this. She forced herself to move, even though every part of her wanted to stay, wanted to hold on to him, wanted to scream until the whole world felt as broken as she did. She stood, wiping her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears and blood and pain across her skin. And then she ran. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give out, until the city swallowed her whole. And when she finally stopped, when she finally collapsed onto a bench in some nameless part of town, staring up at the sky that didn't care about her loss, didn't care about the boy who had believed in her, didn't care about anything at all, she sang. Not loudly. Not the way she did on stage. Not the way that demanded attention, that commanded a room. No, this was something different. Something quieter. Something raw. It was for him. Only for him. And as the first light of morning crept across the horizon, as the city slowly woke around her, as the weight of everything settled into the deepest part of her bones, she knew. She wasn't done. Not yet. Samuel had given up everything to make sure she had a chance. And she wasn't going to waste it. Not now. Not ever. Years passed, but the night Samuel died never left Clara. It clung to her like a second skin, a ghost she carried with her in every note she sang, in every shadowed alley she passed, in every breath she took when she thought about how he had begged her to run, how he had asked her to sing for him with his last bit of strength. She had disappeared that night, vanishing into the cracks of the city, changing her name, cutting ties with everyone who had known her before. She moved from place to place, waiting tables when she had to, singing in smoky bars under names that weren't hers, always watching her back, always listening for the whisper of footsteps behind her. But the past never let go. Not completely. One evening in Chicago, years after that night, she stepped onto a small stage in a rundown club where no one knew her, wearing a dress that wasn't hers, carrying a heart still too full of grief. She closed her eyes and began to sing, her voice deeper now, rougher, aged by time and loss, by the weight of ghosts. And as the final note trembled into silence, she opened her eyes and saw him. Not Samuel. No, Samuel was gone. But the man who had sent him. A man in a dark suit, seated near the back, half hidden in the shadows, watching her with the same cold intensity she had seen once before. Her blood turned to ice. She had known this day would come, had known she couldn't run forever, but still, terror gripped her, made her hands tremble as she clutched the microphone stand. The man didn't move. He simply sat there watching. Then he stood, walked toward the exit, paused, and tipped his hat before disappearing into the night. It was a message. They still knew where she was. They had always known. And they were letting her know that her time was running out. Clara didn't sleep that night. She packed a small suitcase, one she had never truly unpacked, because part of her had always been waiting for this. But as she reached for the doorknob, something in her stilled. She had spent so many years running, hiding, afraid. But she was tired of being afraid. And more than that, she was tired of being silent. Samuel had died so she could have a voice. So she could be more. And running now would mean his death had meant nothing. That she had meant nothing. So instead of leaving, she did something she had never done before. She went to the biggest jazz club in the city and asked for an audition. She sang as if the past was chasing her, as if Samuel was standing beside her, as if the weight of every scar, every injustice, every lost dream was pouring out through her voice. And the world listened. The performance led to another, and another, until, within months, she was no longer an unknown voice in a dark bar. She was somebody. A name people whispered about. A woman whose voice could shake walls, whose songs carried heartbreak and defiance in equal measure. And when she was invited to perform in New York, she knew what she had to do. She stepped onto the grandest stage of her life, the spotlight burning down on her, the audience a sea of faces blurred together by the heat of the moment. And then, she told him the story. Not all of it. Not the names, not the details that could still get her killed. But the truth of it. The truth about the man who had given his life so that she could stand here now. The truth about what it meant to be hunted, to be silenced, to be told that you were too much or not enough, to be made small because the world couldn't handle you at your full size. And when she finished, there was silence. And then applause. And then headlines. Her name spread like wildfire, her voice a symbol of something more than music. A movement. A force. And she knew, the asterisk were still watching. But now, so was the world. And maybe that was the only protection she had left. Years later, she sat alone in a dressing room before the biggest performance of her career, staring at her reflection. She was older now. Wiser. Still carrying ghosts. And as she touched the locket around her neck, the only thing of Samuel she had ever kept, she whispered the same words he had told her all those years ago. Sing for me, Clara, and she did. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.